Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm Dan Vogel.
Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. We're going to conclude our conversation with historian Dan Vogel. He'll talk about what he thinks about apologetic arguments with the Book of Abraham. It's going to be a very interesting conversation, and I'd really like to thank Dan for spending so much time talking with us. So thanks again, Dan. I really appreciate it. Now back to our conversation.
So this part 2 doesn't come from anything dealing with Abraham, really. But it becomes really important because this part 2, it gives God, Jesus, mankind, ministers, ordained, unordained ministers. So it's giving grades of humans. Then that finally evolves into the celestial kingdom. And then the definition for the telestial kingdom. And then it then explodes into the Egyptian cosmology of 15 ruling planets, 15 moving planets, 15 fixed planets, 3 ruling ones, 12 other planets. So what Joseph Smith ends up doing there is copying what he did in the Kirtland Temple with the pulpits, where the 3 presidencies, and the 12 apostles, or the 12 high priests of the High Council, right? High Council of Kirtland, High Council of Missouri, So he has this presidency of the, K. Van Rash, 2 others. I can't pull on my head right away. Oliblish and anyway. So so he has 3 ruling planets over here, and then he has 12 others, makes 15. So he has kind of a pattern of the priesthood as he understood it in 1835 being projected onto the heavens. So in the alphabets, you have the beginning of that, which doesn't really, he does the pure language symbols that are the same. Then he starts taking from like column 3, I think it is, from next to facsimile 1. And then he adds a few in between, and he takes more off of there and adds a few in between. What he's doing is, he's making an alphabet. He makes one. There's like one with it. It looks like a man with his hands raised above the head, and he gives a Masonic definition, a sign of grief and distress that will help you escape. But then the next sign he invents, which is just a U, which is like that shape. So he does several things. One's a bird, and then he does a couple of more shapes that aren't on the papyri. So he's making it like an alphabet. And then he gives names, and then he gives definitions. But in the alphabets, in July, he makes characters, but he doesn't give definitions. But these characters get copied into the grammar book. But before I get to the grammar book, he keeps on going with part 3, part 4, part 5, without any names or definitions. But they are copied without alteration from the columns next to facsimile 1. So then they figure they need more room. These things are like pamphlets, And they copy these characters. So part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5 of the first degree. It says the first degree without explaining anything else. Then they copy these into the grammar book. And they copy the first part in 5 degrees. So they take the first part of the alphabet, they copy it across 5 degrees, and they leave blank pages. This character, the next character, and all 5 degrees. And Joseph Smith gives definitions and expands them as it gets to the 5th. Then when they finish the first part, they get into the second part of the pure language. And there they do it differently. The first one goes in the first degree, the second character in the second, and he keeps going until it gets to the astronomy part. Then it goes across to all 5 degrees because he wants to develop them more. He's really into that. So my explanation is that he's using this. He starts a translation. It's about Abraham, but he needs a brainstorm. Okay, he doesn't have much time. He's still July. He's just barely got him, right? In the Book of Mormon, he had to have 4 years to think about it. But here, so he needs to stall. He needs to think about what he wants. I think he basically knows what he wants to do. Because there are, in the English text, when you read the English text, it tells you what he's trying to prove. Okay? He wants to prove the high priesthood, that there's a lineage that came up from the fathers to Abraham of the high priesthood. The priesthood ban, the patriarchal priesthood ban on the descendants of Ham. Later in Nauvoo, it becomes a preexistence, the plurality of gods. So he's like a pseudepigraphist. The ancient pseudepigraphists smuggle in new doctrines by writing pseudepigraphical texts. So that's what he's doing. But he's brainstorming. So he could brainstorm on these characters and expand them in each of the 5 degrees. Because the 5th one goes way, especially on the cosmology, Kolob and all that, just goes big. On the 5th degree, he starts out small. And you could tell when he's doing like the female line of the princess and queens and stuff, it's a little artificial between 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and 5th. He's just trying to look like it expands. But when he gets to the cosmology, boy, by the time he gets to the 5th, it's like a huge paragraph. And so that's how he delays it till November, from July to November, and then he thinks it works it out in his mind, gets that flash of inspiration, get the paper, boom, and he dictates it. He's got the picture he wants, and he goes for it fairly well.
He's studying it out in his mind.
Yeah. So on what's really important too is that D&C 107, believe it or not, ties into this. Because in D&C 107 is where he's expanding the 2 layers of priesthood, the lesser priesthood, the high priesthood, or the patriarchal priesthood, and that there's a line from Adam to Enoch, and that Adam in the valley of Adam-on-Diamond gives a blessing to his posterity, and that they were all there, the people that were alive anyway, in this lineage, and that they were all high priests. This is something that's missing from the Bible. There's no high priest. There's a Melchizedek who's a priest. And then the book of Hebrews makes it into, Jesus, the great high priest after the order of Melchizedek, But Melchizedek's just a priest. And there's no lineage coming up. The Bible doesn't talk about Adam having a priesthood and handing it down to Seth and so on to Enoch and then to Noah. And finally it gets to Moses. So what he's trying to do in the expansion to D&C 107, which was originally about the high presidency of the high priesthood being over the bishop, he expands it to include this lineage of the high priesthood. But then it says, and all of this will be explained in the Book of Enoch. All this is written in the Book of Enoch to be revealed in due time. So I believe he was working on, and the Book of Enoch would have been in the pure Adamic language. And he was going to dictate a Book of Enoch that explained the high priesthood. That would have been the pseudepigraphic text. This just alludes to it. This would have been the text to prove that there's the high priesthood. A lot of the men that Joseph Smith ordained to the high priesthood didn't get it. Why this extra priesthood? Some of them complained. Why do we need this high priesthood? And some of them didn't even want it, really. And they thought the eldership, that was enough. The apostleship's wound up in that. What can be greater? So, high priesthood, Jesus is the only high priest. So some people had that, So the answer is, and Joseph Smith wasn't the only one struggling with high priesthood. There was the Jews, the Talmud, the Midrash. They all struggled with how did they give animal sacrifices, by what authority, before the Levites? And so the Jews would struggle over this, and they would quote, Psalms 110 about Melchizedek, which is used by Christians as an allusion to Jesus too. The Lord said to my Lord. Oh, the Lord said to my Lord. There's a Trinity. There's the Father and Son talking. Well, the Jews would refer to that for a different reason. That Abraham received the priesthood from Melchizedek. That's what it was really about. And that Abraham's scribe actually is the author of that psalm. And so Christians struggled with it also. Christian theologians struggled with it. So Joseph Smith solved that. There was a lineage of patriarchal priesthood. And this was partially to justify the ordination of Joseph Smith Sr. to the patriarchy, to the office of patriarch, or the patriarchal priesthood, to give blessings, the spiritual blessings. And when Oliver Cowdery copied the blessings into the Patriarchal Blessing Book in September of 1835, that's when he introduced John the Baptist giving authority and Peter, James, and John giving authority, and said that this was as ancient Joseph prophesied on the other scroll that they're working with.
That they never translated.
That they didn't translate. Mm-hmm. But Oliver Cowdery mentions this in the Patriarchal Blessing Book. In the introduction to Joseph Smith Sr.'s blessings, which they expanded these blessings beyond what was given in 1833, they expanded them. But in the introduction, Oliver Cowdery explained how can Joseph Smith Sr., by what authority did he give these blessings that he's about to write? And he says it from his son, who was ordained as a patriarch, that Joseph Smith held as an elder, the authority of the patriarch that he gave his father. Then when Oliver Cowdery writes his own blessing that Joseph Smith gave him in 1833, Joseph Smith expanded his own blessing to include that an allusion to be receiving authority, the lesser priesthood, by John the Baptist, one in the bush from one who got it, for John the Baptist anyway, and then those who got it from the Messiah gave it to them. No date, of course, but it's an allusion to the Peter, James, and John. In fulfillment of the ancient Joseph's prediction.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm with you then. So I guess in a nutshell, the Hugh Nibley line of reasoning or whatever is, we've got these Kirtland Egyptian papers. They don't match. The translation's incorrect from what we have. We we lost it in the Great Chicago Fire, but there was something that was lost, which I guess, could we assume that that's the Book of Joseph that was lost in Chicago?
No. We have the Book of Joseph, which is the Ta Sheret Mem papyrus, which is part of the ones that are chopped up onto the thick paper that we have.
Those are the Joseph scrolls.
That was identified as Joseph. In December of 1835, Oliver Cowdery, in the Messenger and Advocate, described that papyrus as including the Pillar of Enoch, also the 3-in-1 God. There's a little drawing of 3 figures.
Mm-hmm. So have we lost anything then?
Yes. We lost the part that was intact, the 2 feet. We have 1 foot of the beginning part, facsimile 1, and the next one, and then another one, another fragment. Then there was 2 more feet, probably, about,
and this is
that were missing, that included facsimile 3. And the reason why we know that is because when Emma sold the papyri to Combs, and then Combs sold it, part of it, to the St. Louis Museum, there was an Egyptologist there, not remembering his name right off, but he gave a description of the papyri for the museum's catalog, and in there mentioned facsimile 3.
Okay.
And Osiris, the name Osiris being on it, because the name Osiris is on this. And
so that's the only piece that we've lost. So essentially we have what
that we know, that we can exactly say. We don't know.
But we have essentially what Joseph said was the entire book of Abraham, the entire book of Joseph. We have those that we can still look at today, but those are really the Horror Scroll and the Book of Breathing Scroll. Is that correct?
Right. So we don't have the Amenhotep fragments. They could have been there. Facsimile 2, the hypocephalus, the round one, was already pretty damaged because they made a drawing of it, and there's parts missing, and Joe Smith had headlock,
filling the
missing parts to make it look nice and neat. I don't think he's being tricky. I just think they're just too fussy about it looking good. But so those could have been among the ones that were burned, or they could have just totally fragmented, and that's why they had them copy parts into these books. But the first 3 fragments we have returned because they were under glass, and they were actually in drawers. And that might have been what the Chicago Museum ended up with. The other parts were intact. So it's 1 scroll. It's like about 3 feet long. We have 1 foot. And there's about 2 feet that got burnt, because this is the one that Egyptologist described in 1857, I think it was, or 6 or 7, and maybe after that. But it was before they sold it to the Chicago Woods Museum. He described it, and he described facsimile 3, that's at the end of, probably the end of the papyrus. John Gee and Kerry Muhlstein tried to say that there was another book, which was Abraham, after that. And they have absolutely no evidence for that. It would help if they had some characters that came off of it, or something. But, so they have this, what historians would call the fallacy of possible proof, which is, oh, there's other scrolls in Egypt that have more than one book on them, because they would make them like 15 feet long, a blank one, and then they would cut it up and make their books. And they would mass produce these books of the dead, and some would be better than others. And these Joseph Smith ones weren't terribly good, and they come from the Ptolemaic period. And Abraham's day didn't have vignettes or the drawings on these Egyptian papyri. So John Gee knows that when the document, Joseph Smith's translation refers to the drawing at the beginning of the record, Abraham could not have written that. So he tries to get around that by saying that these parts were added, but no, they weren't added. These parts referring to the facsimile were not added. They were corrected, like I mentioned, a little bit, but they weren't added whole cloth. They're just totally wrong about that. So, and that Abraham and the Egyptologists go out of their minds, like Robert Rittner and Cohen. Anyway, for the Egyptians to put a Hebrew text that denied their gods with their most sacred book together on one scroll, bury it with the dead, it'd just be totally outrageous. They wouldn't do, it'd be crazy. They wouldn't do that. It doesn't fit. So, for John Gee and Kerry Muhlestein to argue that, some other scrolls have more than one book, therefore this could have another book, that's a fallacy of possible proof. You need to make it probable for a historian to pay any attention. Anybody that respects evidence needs more than that. And so there's a huge, huge problem with trying to say the scrolls were longer. And Kerry Muhlestein published in the Journal of Mormon History fairly recently, year or so ago, where he tried to prove what I call the long scroll theory, which is he tried to get people to say that after 1837, when these fragments were cut off, or they probably fell off and they were mounted under glass, other people described, they would come along, these were not Mormons, most of these people, they would come along and have the tour and see the mummies, and Lucy Smith would show some of the scrolls. She would roll out the scroll and say, well, this is a record of Abraham. I mean, he said a long scroll, but who knows what a long scroll is. But it could be the 2 foot, and when it's only 4 inches wide, 2 feet looks like long. And she rolled out this long scroll and said this was record 8. It could have been facsimile 3 and the rest of what broke off and got burnt. It doesn't mean that, it goes on for 10 feet. Gee tries to say that this scroll was like 10 feet long, at least, for 2 books, because that's what he needs it to be. But there's no other examples of books of breathing being written with other books along with it. And why would Abraham write a record and then refer to the facsimile at the beginning of his record? So there's so many wishful thinkings going on with this kind of approach to arguing. Nibley first tried, this is just a variation of what Nibley first tried, actually. He tried to say, there's red writing, there's no red writing on it. And Mike Marquardt wrote a response after he said that, Cowdery's describing both records together, that they're beautifully written in black ink and a part in red ink, which the scroll that was identified as Joseph has red ink things here and there all over the place. So he didn't separate. And the people that came along, Muhlestein he has like 7 testimonies, most of them are this. They took the tour and said that, oh, we saw the scrolls from which the Book of Abraham came from, or scroll. And without differentiating between the fragments under the glass and the intact scroll, So he says, oh, they can't be referring. So we saw the scroll, which could be that 2 feet, from which the Book of Abraham came from, which is, they're looking at facsimile 3, and because the translation documents take characters from the fragments under the glass, Milstein argues, well, that means that the translation of the Book of Abraham didn't come from those fragments. It really came from the scroll, which probably had a part that went longer and included the Book of Abraham. So, which doesn't work at all. I mean, the people making these comments don't have the information that they need to answer the question that Milstein's trying to answer.
Okay. Well, I've kept you a long time, and I really appreciate you spending so much time.
Sure.
Is there anything you want to finish up with on this? You want to talk about any of your either books in the work or past books that are for sale or anything like that?
I don't have anything for sale right now, really. I'm trying to put together a book on the Book of Abraham that's based on those 8 videos that I made on YouTube.
Uh-huh.
I'm also working in completing in about a year and a half my biography of Joseph Smith in Kirtland, Ohio, and far west Missouri.
Oh, cool. And then how many other books have you written total?
I don't know, about 18 probably.
18?
Well, there's the 8-volume History of the Church, critical edition, 5 volumes.
That's really expensive too, isn't it?
About $1,000,
yeah.
But it might be more now. But really, not that much if you consider how long it took me 10 years.
Yeah, I bet.
So, and I got paid as I went on that one,
Yeah.
and I don't get royalties. So, but they're all sold out, I think.
Well, I know, but only libraries can afford those, right?
No, there's a lot of people bought them.
It's out of my price range. I know that.
Oh, yeah. So maybe they'll come out with a Kindle edition. Huh?
There you go. There you go.
Then there was 5 volumes of the early Mormon documents, which was all the documents I could get my hands on from that pertain to Joseph Smith and the Smith family that pertains to before 1831. They might date afterwards, but I only took out parts of these excerpts or whatever I needed, whole documents, civil documents, diaries, legal documents, anything that dealt with Mormonism before 1831. And my first book was on Indian origins in the Book of Mormon, which was a survey of the pre-1830 literature on the Indians and theories about how the origin of the Indians being from the 10 tribes, the mound builder myth about a white race being destroyed by the darker Indian race and buried in the mounds. There were different kinds of mounds, fortification mounds, temple mounds, and burial mounds. And they imagined they're a long chain from South America through Central America up to the Great Lakes region, where they were destroyed in the Great Lakes region. So that's basically the Book of Mormon historical framework. And the Indian Israelite thesis, Joseph Smith picking a different version than the 10 tribes, but still Israelite. My second book was The Religious Seekers and the Advent of Mormonism, which was about the priesthood, or authority anyway, being restored by new apostles being sent. And these apostles would have a new revelation, and some of these seekers imagined it possible that an angel could be sent to ordain new apostles. And that was in Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith Sr. was influenced in the seeker belief that there was a complete apostasy and that we're waiting for a restoration. And Lucy Mack Smith's brother, Jason Mack, was a seeker preacher, actually, and had a communal group in New Brunswick, I mean. So that was my second book. The third book was The Word of God, a collection of essays on Mormon scripture. There was contribution to Brent's book on new approaches to the Book of Mormon, where I wrote about anti-universalist rhetoric in the Book of Mormon. The Order of Nehor in the Book of Mormon are basically universalists, where the missionaries, Alma, Amulek, preach against the Nehorites. So that's all has subtle messages, and the way they use scripture out of the New Testament against universalism is the same as Joseph Smith's contemporaries, the Christians against, or mainstream Christians against universalism and Unitarianism. So that's what that article is about. And
Mormonism Unveiled, Making of a Prophet.
The American Apocrypha, which had 2 essays in there on one on Anti-Masonry Revisited, which was a spin-off of an article I wrote in the John Whitmer Historical Journal on the Book of Mormon as an anti-Masonic Bible, which is words quoted from Martin Harris. The Book of Mormon is the anti-Masonic Bible, he said, up in Ohio. So, northern Ohio. So in that American Apocrypha book, there's that essay and another essay on the Book of Mormon witnesses and how they actually saw the plates or felt the plates and what really probably happened from a fuller analysis of all of the testimonies that they gave during their life.
You are prolific.
The E.D. Howe book.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's good enough. I'll provide a link
to
your Amazon page.
Joseph Smith biography, The Making of a Prophet. Anyway.
Cool. All right. Well,
so I love studying Mormon history. I studied. I'm still a DNA Mormon, 6th generation Mormon. I love studying Mormonism when I was a believer in it, and the love of studying Mormon history didn't leave me because my interpretations changed over time as I learned. Anyway.
Well, cool.
Thanks for coming and talking to me.
I appreciate it. So are you coming to MHA, by the way?
No.
No? Oh, that's too bad. I'll be there. Since
I might be there for Sunstone.
Oh, good. All right. Well, Dan Vogel, thank you so much. I appreciate all your time.
You're welcome.
Mm-hmm. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with historian Dan Vogel. Dan, I really appreciate you spending so much time. It was really cool learning from you, and also for feeding me lunch, so I really appreciate that. So I'd encourage you all to check out his book, Joseph Smith, Making of a Prophet, or Mormonism Unveiled. I think they're all really interesting and great contributions to Mormon history. In our next conversation, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jana Reese and Dr. Benjamin Knoll. So we're going to talk about their next book, The Next Mormons, and they're going to tell us about how to get a simple random sample, a scientific survey. And so Dr. Knoll will tell us about that.
We contracted with a firm who has been a leader in developing these methodologies and has been an approach that has been used successfully not only by Pew Research but other social scientists who have tried to get at Mormons in the population. Because for the very reason that you're talking about, it's 2% at best of the US population. So when we make these telephone surveys, that means that 1 out of every 50 people, if you're random digit dialing, is going to be someone who says, yes, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's a lot of man hours you got to go through to make so many calls to get several hundred, if not at least 1,000 surveys completed there, and that's just simply not feasible unless you're a big, big, big organization who can do that.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please support Gospel Tangents and become a subscriber. For just $5 a month, go to patreon.com/gospeltangents and you can hear the entire interview. And you can also get transcripts available at either our Amazon website, or if you want to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website at gospeltangents.com, and you can click the yellow subscribe button. Of course, we're also on Facebook, Twitter, and all the other places. Make sure you subscribe on iTunes at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. And don't forget to click here to subscribe on YouTube, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again for listening.